My grandfather made me fight my brother until he bled so we could eat. When I told him we were done and bluffed about recording everything, he just laughed and said, "You boys made me millions." I walked away without looking back. That was a decade ago. Yesterday, he watched his house get seized by the feds in total silence. In my family, all the boys had to follow one rule: make your cousin bleed or go hungry for the week. You see, every Saturday, all my male cousins between the ages 10 and 18 would gather in my grandfather's garage. Two boys entered the chalk circle. Only the one who made his opponent bleed got to eat dinner for the next week. They called it building brotherhood through suffering. My grandfather started this tradition after returning from Vietnam. "I watched soft American boys die crying for their mothers," he'd tell us, his glass eyes scanning our faces. "No grandson of mine will be weak." My uncles enforced the rules with pride. Uncle Paulo kept a photo album of his fight victories, pages of his cousins' bloody faces from the 1980s. So when I turned 10, I spent my birthday standing in the fight garage for the first time, surrounded by cousins nursing old wounds. I tried to tell myself it wouldn't be that bad, that I could just force myself to zone out and pretend it wasn't happening. Boy, was I wrong. Turns out, it wasn't just drawing blood. You fought until blood hit the concrete floor. No medical help until the winner was finished eating their dinner. Winners ate like kings, while losers sat at the same table watching. Brothers fought brothers. Fathers placed bets. "First fight's always special," Uncle Vito announced, pushing me toward the circle. My opponent? My cousin Eddie, also 10, also terrified. The men formed a wall around us, chanting, "Blood brings brotherhood," over and over. Eddie and I circled each other, neither of us wanting to throw the first punch. "Hit him!" my father screamed. So I did. I hit him until his nose cracked and red drops splattered the floor. That night I ate chicken and rice while Eddie sat across from me with an empty plate and a towel pressed to his face. The months that followed broke something in all of us. My 12-year-old brother Joey nearly lost his left eye fighting our cousin Frank. Tommy, once the sweetest kid, learned to fight dirty, fish-hooking eyes and biting chunks from ears. "Gotta eat," he'd say afterward, spitting blood. By my 15th fight, I'd only won 7 times. Not enough to avoid the hollow feeling of hunger, but enough to know the sick satisfaction of watching others go without. I hated who I was becoming, and our community was so small that over half of the teachers at my school were somewhat related to us, so they made sure no questions got asked. I knew if I didn't find an answer soon, then my life would be over, but I wanted the problem to go away by itself, and one day, it did. We were preparing for the spring play when the drama teacher showed us theatrical blood packets, tiny pouches that burst on impact, creating realistic blood effects. That was my light bulb moment. I pocketed a few every day to test out my idea, so by the time Saturday came around, I palmed a packet before entering the chalk circle. When my cousin Sal grabbed me in a headlock, I slapped the packet against my nose until fake blood poured down my face. "Blood on the floor!" Uncle Vito shouted. Sal won. I went hungry, and for the first time, I wasn't mad about it. Instead, I focused on stealing more packets. I taught my younger cousins the technique during bathroom breaks. We developed a system, choreographed moves that looked brutal but caused no damage. A fake stumble here, a packet slap there. For 3 beautiful months, we outsmarted our fathers. We rotated wins based on who needed food most. My little brother was smiling again. We were actors, not gladiators. Everything was going smoothly until my granddad turned to my cousin's unmarked face after a brutal fight. "Where are the bruises?" he asked. "How did they heal so fast?" The room went silent, and I pretended to find the peas on my plate extremely fascinating. We thought he'd forget about it, but he didn't. And the next Saturday, everything changed. Strip searches, metal detectors, uncles stationed as referees inside the circle. When they found the blood packets taped inside Nicky's waistband, my grandfather made an example of him. 3 18-year-olds against 1 14-year-old. Real blood, real screams. Nicky didn't walk right for weeks. "You're next," my father promised me that night. "Fight like a man, or I'll show you what real brotherhood means." I didn't say a word before pulling out my phone. I've been recording these fights for 8 months. Every beating, every forced starvation. It's all uploaded to a cloud drive that CPS and the police already have access to. Every word of what I said was a lie, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was that they stopped with the violence, once and for all. "We're done bleeding for you," Eddie announced. Vinny was already on a call. "Police? We need help at 1847 Oakwood Drive. Child abuse in progress." That's when my grandfather started laughing. Slow at first, then harder. "You think this was about making you tough?" He pulled out his phone, swiping through bank statements. Every fight, every bet, every drop of blood, live streamed to underground gambling rings across 3 continents. "You boys made me millions." The room erupted. My father lunged at grandfather. Uncle Paulo smashed the live stream equipment hidden in the rafters. Sirens wailed outside. "The real brotherhood?" Grandfather wheezed through his laughter. "Was the money we made along the way?" The police burst through the garage door seconds later, their flashlights cutting through the chaos. My grandfather slipped his phone into his pocket and raised his hands, that sick smile never leaving his face. The officers swept through the room, taking in the chalk circle, the bloodstains, the trembling younger cousins huddled in the corner. I watched my father get handcuffed, his face a mixture of rage and disbelief. Uncle Paulo tried to run, but got tackled near the side door. The sound of breaking glass filled the air as more uncles destroyed evidence, smashing cameras and monitors I hadn't even known existed. My grandfather caught my eye and winked. That's when I knew this wasn't over. The next 3 hours blurred together. Police statements, social workers arriving, cousins getting medical examinations. They separated us into different rooms for questioning, and I stuck to my story about the recordings. The lie felt heavier each time I repeated it, especially when Detective Martinez asked to see the evidence. I stalled, claiming the files were encrypted, and I'd need my laptop at home to access them. She nodded, making notes, but I could see the doubt creeping into her expression. My hands shook as I signed my statement. By dawn, they'd arrested 6 of our fathers and uncles. My grandfather posted bail within hours. The others would follow soon, their lawyers already circling like vultures. As I climbed into the social worker's car, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Nice bluff, grandson. Let's see how long you can keep it up." My stomach dropped. He knew. Of course he knew. They placed us younger cousins in emergency foster care, splitting us across different homes. I ended up with Eddie and 2 others at a house 20 minutes from our neighborhood. The foster parents, an older couple named the Washingtons, seemed nice enough, but I couldn't focus on their welcoming words. My mind raced with one thought. I had to make the lie real. That first night, Eddie cornered me in the bedroom we shared. His voice barely rose above a whisper as he grabbed my shoulder. I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear we'd all carried for years. He wanted to know if the recordings were real. I shook my head, and his face went pale. We both knew what would happen when grandfather realized the truth. The foster home wouldn't protect us. Nothing would. The next morning, I borrowed Mrs. Washington's laptop under the pretense of doing homework. My fingers flew across the keyboard, researching hidden cameras, cloud storage, anything that might help me create evidence after the fact. But every option required equipment I didn't have, access to the garage I couldn't get, or technical skills beyond my abilities. Eddie watched from the doorway, biting his nails. When I slammed the laptop shut in frustration, he sat beside me. "We needed help," he said. "We needed the others." Over the next 2 days, we secretly contacted our cousins through borrowed phones and social media accounts. The responses varied. Some were too scared to even reply. Others, like my brother Joey, were angry I'd lied and put everyone at risk. But a few understood the situation. Sal, despite our history in the ring, offered to help. So did Tommy and 3 younger cousins, who'd barely started fighting before everything exploded. We met at a McDonald's after school, crowding into a corner booth. The plan we hatched was desperate and probably stupid, but it was all we had. If we couldn't produce the old recordings, we'd create new evidence, testimony, documentation, enough to keep grandfather and the others locked up. Tommy had kept a journal, documenting every fight for the past 2 years. Sal's little brother Marcus still had bruises and scars we could photograph. Eddie remembered dates and details with surprising accuracy. We spent hours in that booth, building our case with napkins and borrowed pens, but grandfather was already moving. The next day at school, 3 of my cousins got pulled from class. Their families had reconciled, according to the principal. They wouldn't be returning to foster care. By lunch, 2 more were gone. Our witnesses were disappearing. That afternoon, I got called to the office. My grandfather sat in the visitor's chair, looking every bit the concerned elder. He'd brought my grandmother, who I hadn't seen in years. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue while he spoke to the principal about family healing and misunderstandings. The principal left us alone for a family moment. The second the door closed, grandfather's mask dropped. He leaned forward, his glass eye somehow more threatening than his real one. He told me I had 2 days to admit the recordings were fake, 2 days to come home and make things right, or things would get very unpleasant for everyone I'd dragged into this mess. My grandmother said nothing, just stared at her hands. I walked out without responding, but my legs shook the entire way back to class. That night, I found Eddie crying in our room. His mom had called the foster home. She wanted him to come home, promised things would be different, but we both knew nothing had changed except grandfather's tactics. The pressure mounted over the following days. More cousins vanished from foster care. Parents showed up with lawyers and tears, claiming misunderstandings and cultural differences. The detective called twice, asking about the recordings. I kept stalling, but time was running out. Then Sal disappeared, not taken by family, just gone. His foster parents found his window open, bed empty, no note, no explanation. The police said he probably ran away, but I knew better. Grandfather was demonstrating his reach. That's when Nicky contacted me. Still limping from his beating, he'd managed to stay hidden at a group home across town. He had something to show me, he said, something important. We met at a public library, Nicky constantly checking over his shoulder. He pulled out an old flip phone, the kind substance dealers used because they were hard to trace. On it were videos, shaky, poor quality, but real. He'd been secretly recording fights for months before I'd even thought of the blood packets. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the footage. It wasn't comprehensive, wasn't the 8 months of evidence I'd claimed, but it was something. Nicky had hidden the phone in the garage rafters, same place grandfather had put his streaming equipment. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. But even with Nicky's videos, we faced a bigger problem, the gambling operation. Grandfather had revealed his true purpose, but proving it would be nearly impossible. The streaming equipment was destroyed, the financial records were probably hidden offshore, and who would believe that a Vietnam veteran had turned his grandsons into gladiators for international betting rings? Eddie and I spent spent every free moment researching, planning, trying to find an angle. We reached out to cousins who'd aged out of the fighting years ago, hoping someone knew more about the gambling side. Most wouldn't talk. The few who did spoke in whispers about debts and threats, about cousins who'd tried to expose things before and faced consequences. A week into our foster placement, Mrs. Washington noticed we weren't sleeping. She made us chamomile tea and sat us down for a talk. We couldn't tell her everything, but she seemed to understand anyway. She'd been a foster parent for 20 years. She'd seen all kinds of family disasters. She gave us advice wrapped in gentle suggestions. Document everything. Stay together. Trust the system, but protect yourselves too. And most importantly, don't let them isolate us. Isolation was how people like grandfather maintained control. The next day brought a new crisis. 3 of our younger cousins, kids who'd barely started fighting, were scheduled for supervised visits with their parents. We all knew what that meant. Once grandfather got them alone, they'd be pressured to recant, to say we'd exaggerated or lied. Eddie and I convinced Mrs. Washington to let us attend the visit as support. The social worker agreed, probably hoping our presence would ease the tension. But walking into that community center meeting room felt like entering the garage all over again. The parents sat on one side, our 3 young cousins on the other. No grandfather, but his presence hung over everything. Uncle Vito led the conversation, all smiles and reconciliation. He spoke about misunderstandings, about how the media had blown things out of proportion, how the family needed to heal together, not apart. I watched my younger cousins shrink with each word. These kids, barely 11 and 12, were being pulled back into the nightmare we'd barely escaped. When Uncle Vito suggested they could come home once this mess was sorted out, I saw the fear flash across their faces. That's when Eddie stood up. His voice cracked, but he kept talking. He reminded them about Nikki's beating, about the hunger, about the blood and the bets and the brotherhood that was really about money. Uncle Vito's smile faltered. The social worker ended the visit early, citing the children's distress. As we filed out, Uncle Vito grabbed my arm. His grip was just tight enough to hurt without leaving marks, a skill all our uncles had perfected. He whispered that grandfather was losing patience, that family problems should stay in the family, that boys who forgot their place sometimes had accidents, very unfortunate accidents. I yanked free and kept walking, but his words followed me home. That night, I showed Eddie the videos from Nikki's phone. We both knew they weren't enough, not to stop grandfather, not to protect everyone, but maybe, just maybe, they were enough to buy us time. The detective called again the next morning. This time, she wasn't asking. She was coming to collect the evidence I'd promised. No more stalls, no more excuses. I had 4 hours to figure out how to turn Nikki's scattered videos into the comprehensive proof I'd claimed to have. 4 hours to save my cousins from being pulled back into grandfather's web. 4 hours to make the biggest bluff of my life believable. Eddie found me in the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face. We locked eyes in the mirror, both thinking the same thing. We'd escaped the garage, but the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And somewhere across town, my grandfather was waiting, confident that blood would always be thicker than justice. I spent the next hour frantically editing Nikki's videos on Mrs. Washington's laptop. My hands moved across the keyboard, cutting clips together, adding timestamps, trying to make scattered footage look comprehensive. Eddie paced behind me, checking the window every few minutes. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 a.m. Detective Martinez stood on the porch with another officer, her expression all business. Mrs. Washington led them to the living room where I waited with the laptop and Nikki's phone. I played the videos, narrating each fight, each beating, each hungry week. The detective took notes, occasionally asking for dates and names. When the footage ended, she looked at me with those sharp eyes. She asked about the 8 months of recordings I'd mentioned. I explained that these were samples, that the full archive was harder to access. She nodded slowly, but I could tell she wasn't buying it completely. After they left with copies of Nikki's videos, Eddie and I sat in silence. We both knew it wasn't enough. The footage showed violence, yes, but not the gambling operation, not the real crime that had funded grandfather's empire. That afternoon, my phone rang. Unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. My cousin Anthony's voice came through, older than me by 5 years and out of the fighting age range. He wanted to meet, said he had information about the gambling operation, said he'd been waiting years for someone brave enough to stand up to grandfather. Eddie shook his head when I told him, but we both knew we needed more evidence. We arranged to meet Anthony at a diner across town, telling Mrs. Washington we were going to the library. Anthony looked terrible, dark circles under his eyes, hands shaking as he stirred his coffee. He'd aged out of fighting at 18, but never escaped the family's shadow. He told us about the real operation, how it started small with local bets, but grew into something massive. He showed us screenshots on his phone, betting websites in languages I couldn't read, wire transfer records. Grandfather had made us famous in certain dark corners of the internet. People paid premium prices to watch American boys destroy each other for food. But Anthony had more than just screenshots. He'd been grandfather's tech assistant for 2 years, setting up the streams, managing the accounts. He'd kept records, insurance against the day grandfather might turn on him, bank statements, website logins, even recordings of grandfather discussing the operation with international contacts. The catch? Everything was stored on grandfather's home computer, in his study. in the house where half my uncles still lived. Eddie immediately started listing all the ways this could go wrong, but Anthony had been planning. He knew the house routine, when people would be gone, how to get in and out quickly. He just needed backup, someone to watch while he copied the files. We agreed to meet again in 2 days to finalize plans. As we left the diner, I noticed a familiar car in the parking lot, Uncle Paulo's truck. My blood ran cold. Back at the foster home, Eddie and I pretended everything was normal. We helped with dinner, did homework, watched TV with the other foster kids, but my mind raced with possibilities. Had Uncle Paulo seen us? Did grandfather know about Anthony? The next morning brought our answer. Anthony's photo appeared on the local news. Car accident, single vehicle, lost control on a straight road, no witnesses. Eddie grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. We both understood. Grandfather was cleaning house. I wanted to run, to hide, to give up, but then I thought about Nikki, still limping, about my little brother Joey, pulled back home to face who knows what punishment, about all the cousins who'd trusted me when I'd promised we were done bleeding. That's when Tommy called. He'd managed to stay in foster care and had news. Some of the older cousins, ones who'd aged out years ago, were talking. The accident had shaken them. They wanted to meet. We gathered at a park that evening, 7 of us total. Former fighters who'd survived the garage but never escaped its shadow. They shared stories I'd never heard. Hospitalizations covered up as sports injuries. Cousins who'd disappeared when they'd tried to expose the truth. The gambling operation went back further than any of us had imagined. One cousin, Vincent, had tried to document everything 5 years ago. Grandfather had him committed to a psychiatric facility for 3 months. When he got out, he never spoke about it again, until now. Vincent pulled out a flash drive. He'd hidden it at a friend's house all these years, too scared to use it. On it were financial records from 2018, showing the early days of the operation. Not enough to bring down grandfather alone, but combined with Nikki's videos and Anthony's information, it might be enough. But we still needed Anthony's files, the complete records that would show the full scope of the operation. And with Anthony gone, only one person knew the passwords and locations. That person was my grandmother. The others thought I was crazy when I suggested approaching her. She'd stood silent for decades, never intervening, never protecting us, but I remembered her face in the principal's office, the way she'd stared at her hands while grandfather threatened me. Eddie and I spent the night planning. We couldn't just walk up to her door. Grandfather would know immediately, but grandmother volunteered at the church thrift shop every Wednesday morning, alone. Wednesday came too quickly. I stood outside the thrift shop, Vincent's flash drive in my pocket, my heart pounding. Eddie waited across the street, ready to call for help if needed. Grandmother looked up when the bell chimed. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she walked to the door, flipped the sign to closed, and turned to face me. She looked older than I remembered, smaller. The silence stretched between us until finally she spoke. She told me Anthony had been like a son to her, that she'd begged grandfather to leave him alone, that his death was the final straw in a marriage that had been dead for years. I showed her Vincent's flash drive, explained what we were trying to do. She listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When I finished, she walked to the back room and returned with a manila envelope. Inside were bank statements, passwords, account numbers, everything Anthony had gathered and more. She'd been collecting evidence for months, knowing this day would come, waiting for someone brave enough to use it. But she warned me that grandfather had eyes everywhere, that he'd know the moment anyone accessed his computer, that we'd have one shot to download everything before he could destroy it all. I asked why she was helping now, after all these years. She pulled up her sleeve, showing old scars I'd never noticed before. Grandfather's cruelty hadn't started with his grandsons. It had just evolved into something more profitable. We had the passwords, the access codes, the location of the files, but getting into grandfather's house would be nearly impossible. Uncle Paulo and Uncle Vito still lived there. Grandfather rarely left, and after Anthony's death, security had been increased. That's when Eddie had an idea. This Saturday would be the first fight night since the arrests. Grandfather would insist on continuing the tradition, police investigation or not. The house would be empty except for him and whatever cousins had been pulled back home. We could create a distraction at the garage, draw everyone there, while someone slipped into the house to access the computer. It was risky, maybe Sewer's Lidl, but it was our only chance. Vincent volunteered to access the computer. He knew the house layout, had lived there briefly after aging out. Tommy and 2 other cousins would create the distraction. Eddie and I would coordinate from outside, ready to call police if everything went wrong. The plan required precise timing. We spent the next 2 days rehearsing, gathering equipment, preparing for every contingency. Mrs. Washington noticed our tension, but didn't pry. She just made sure we ate and reminded us that we could talk to her about anything. Friday night, I couldn't sleep. Eddie and I went over the plan again and again. Vincent had a USB drive that would automatically copy everything once inserted. Tommy had smoke bombs from a joke shop, harmless but attention-getting. Everyone knew their role. Saturday arrived gray and drizzling, perfect weather for what felt like a funeral. We took positions around the neighborhood, communicating through a group chat. At 6 p.m. fight time, Tommy reported that grandfather and 4 uncles were in the garage with 3 young cousins. Vincent made his move. He slipped through the back door using grandmother's key. We tracked his progress through terse messages. In the house, at the study, computer on. Then Tommy lit the smoke bombs. The garage erupted in chaos. Cousins cousins screaming about fire, uncles rushing to investigate. Grandfather's voice boomed over the confusion, demanding order. Vincent had 5 minutes, maybe less. I watched the house from across the street, Eddie beside me, both of us barely breathing. Every passing car made us jump. Every shadow could be an uncle returning. 4 minutes. Vincent messaged that files were copying. 70% complete. 80. 90. Then Uncle Paulo's truck peeled out of the garage area, heading for the house. Someone had figured out the distraction. Eddie grabbed my arm, ready to run, but I stayed frozen, watching. Vincent burst from the front door just as Uncle Paulo pulled up. They faced each other for a heartbeat. Then Vincent ran. Uncle Paulo gave chase on foot, leaving his truck running. I didn't think. I ran to the truck, grabbed Vincent's USB drive from where he'd dropped it, and dove into the passenger seat just as Eddie jumped behind the wheel. We peeled out, Uncle Paulo's shouts fading behind us. We drove in circles for 20 minutes, making sure we weren't followed, before heading to the predetermined meeting spot, an abandoned lot where the others waited. Vincent had made it there on foot, bleeding from a cut on his forehead but smiling. The USB drive contained everything: years of financial records, videos of grandfather discussing prices for specific matches, contact information for international betting syndicates, enough evidence to put him away for decades. But we still had to get it to the right people. Detective Martinez was one option, but we worried about grandfather's connections in local law enforcement. We needed someone above his reach. That's when Mrs. Washington surprised us. She'd followed us to the lot, worried when we'd disappeared. When we explained everything, showed her the evidence, she made a call. Her nephew worked for the FBI's cybercrime division. Within hours, we were in a federal building, copying files, giving statements, watching as agents verified the international gambling connections. The raids happened simultaneously. Grandfather's house, the garage, Uncle Paulo's home. Federal agents swept through, seizing computers, documents, everything. This time, no amount of bail money would help. But grandfather wasn't finished. Even from federal custody, he had reach. Messages started appearing. Cousins still loyal to him threatened those who'd cooperated. Dead animals showed up on doorsteps. Vincent's car tires were slashed. The FBI offered witness protection, but most of us refused. We'd spent our whole lives running from grandfather's shadow. It was time to stand and fight. The trial date was set for 6 months out. 6 months of depositions, threats, family choosing sides. Some uncles cooperated, hoping for lighter sentences. Others remained loyal to grandfather, convinced he'd somehow escape justice. During those months, something beautiful happened. Cousins who'd been forced to fight began talking, really talking. Support groups formed, therapy sessions. We learned to be family without violence, without hunger, without blood on concrete floors. Eddie and I remained at the Washingtons, who'd opened their home to 2 more cousins. We attended school, caught up on years of disrupted education. I joined the drama club, using those skills I'd learned with blood packets for something positive, but the threats continued. Grandfather's loyalists made sure we never felt safe. Windows broken, graffiti on foster homes, constant reminders that grandfather's reach extended beyond prison walls. 3 months before trial, Nicky disappeared again. This time, he left a note. He couldn't handle the pressure, the threats, the memories. He promised to return for the trial, but needed to hide until then. His disappearance shook everyone. Some cousins wavered, wondering if testifying was worth it. Grandfather's lawyer filed motion after motion, trying to dismiss charges, suppress evidence, anything to avoid trial. That's when grandmother stepped forward again. She'd been quiet since giving me the passwords, but Nicky's disappearance sparked something. She filed for divorce and announced she'd testify against grandfather. She knew things no one else did. Decades of crimes beyond just the fighting ring. Her announcement changed everything. Uncles who'd been loyal started reconsidering. If grandmother was turning against grandfather, what chance did he have? One by one, they began making deals with prosecutors, but grandfather had one more card to play. 2 weeks before trial, the FBI's computers were hacked. Someone tried to delete our evidence, corrupt the files. They almost succeeded. Almost. Vincent had learned from his past mistakes. He'd made multiple copies, stored them in different locations, even mailed USB drives to lawyers in other states. The hacking attempt only proved how desperate grandfather had become. The trial approached like a storm on the horizon. Cousins flew in from across the country, those who'd escaped years ago finally ready to speak. The media caught wind of the story. Fight Club grandfather became a national headline. We tried to stay focused on the facts, not the sensationalism. This wasn't entertainment. This was our lives, our scars, our stolen childhoods. Every interview request was carefully considered. We wanted justice, not fame. The week before trial, I visited grandfather in federal detention. I'm not sure why. Maybe I needed to see him powerless. Maybe I wanted answers. Eddie tried to talk me out of it, but I had to go. He sat across from me in orange jumpsuit, his glass eye somehow dimmer than I remembered. For the first time, he looked old, defeated, but when he smiled, I saw the monster was still there. He told me I'd destroyed the family. That blood meant nothing to my generation, that we'd grown soft, weak, everything he'd tried to prevent. I let him talk, studying the man who'd terrorized us for so long. When he finished, I stood to leave. He called after me, asking if I was proud of myself. I turned back and told him the truth. I was proud. Proud that we'd found courage he'd tried to hit out of us. Proud that we'd chosen justice over blood. The trial would start in 3 days. Cousins gathered at hotel rooms, preparing testimony, supporting each other. Nikki had returned as promised, thin but determined. Even Joey had broken free from our father's influence, ready to testify. Federal prosecutors warned us it would be brutal. Defense attorneys would attack our credibility, claim we were lying for attention or money. They'd drag out every fight, every beating, make us relive it all. But we were ready. We'd already survived grandfather's garage. We'd survived the hunger, the violence, the years of fear. A courtroom couldn't be worse than that concrete circle. The night before trial, we held our own gathering, not in a garage, but in a park, not for fighting, but for solidarity. Cousins who'd been forced to hurt each other stood together, finally united against our true enemy. Eddie spoke about redemption, Tommy about healing, Vincent about justice delayed but not denied. Even the youngest cousins, those saved from ever entering the circle, understood the weight of what we were about to do. As I looked around at my cousins, my brothers in survival rather than suffering, I realized grandfather had been wrong about everything. Blood didn't make brotherhood, choice did, and we'd chosen each other. Tomorrow, we'd walk into that courtroom and tell the world what happened in grandfather's garage. We'd expose the gambling empire built on children's blood. We'd ensure no cousin would ever again choose between violence and hunger. The evidence was solid. The witnesses were ready. The FBI had traced the gambling operation across 3 continents, frozen millions in assets. Grandfather's empire was crumbling, but more importantly, we were healing. The cousins who'd been forced to fight were learning to trust. The younger ones were growing up without fear. The cycle of violence was finally breaking. As we prepared for bed that night, Eddie reminded me how far we'd come. From that first lie about recordings to this moment, facing down grandfather with actual evidence and federal prosecutors. We'd turned a desperate bluff into real justice. The trial would be our final fight, not with fists in a chalk circle, but with truth in a courtroom. And this time, everyone would eat. Everyone would be safe. Everyone would be free. Grandfather thought blood would always be thicker than justice. Tomorrow, we'd prove him wrong once and for all. The boy who'd once made his cousin bleed for chicken and rice was ready to make his grandfather pay for every drop of blood spilled on that concrete floor. The morning would come soon enough. But tonight, surrounded by cousins who'd become true brothers, I finally felt something I'd never experienced in grandfather's garage: peace. The morning of the trial arrived with unexpected news. Grandfather's lawyer had filed for a last-minute plea deal. The federal prosecutor called Mrs. Washington's house at 6 a.m., explaining that grandfather wanted to negotiate. I dressed quickly, my hands steady for the first time in months. At the federal building, cousins gathered in the hallway, whispering about what this meant. Eddie found me near the water fountain, his face a mixture of hope and suspicion. We both knew grandfather never surrendered without an angle. The prosecutor emerged from a conference room an hour later. Grandfather would plead guilty to racketeering and child endangerment, but only if we agreed to sealed records. No media, no public testimony. The gambling operation details would remain confidential to protect ongoing international investigations. Some cousins erupted in anger. They wanted the world to know. They wanted grandfather exposed completely. But I thought about our younger cousins, about the chance to move forward without becoming a spectacle. The prosecutor gave us 2 hours to decide. We huddled in an empty courtroom, 23 cousins debating our future. Vincent argued for transparency. Tommy wanted whatever kept us safest. The younger ones just wanted it over. Finally, grandmother entered, having driven herself despite her arthritis. She moved to the center of our circle, looking at each of us. Then she explained what grandfather feared most: poverty and irrelevance. A public trial would make him infamous. Sealed records would make him forgotten. The choice became clearer. We voted 19 for the plea deal, 4 against. The prosecutor nodded when we delivered our decision. Within an hour, we sat in a courtroom watching grandfather, in shackles, formally admit to organizing illegal gambling using minors, child endangerment, and racketeering. 25 years federal prison. No possibility of parole for 15. Asset forfeiture of $4.2 million to be distributed to victims. The judge's gavel came down with finality. Uncle Paulo and Uncle Vito received 8 years each. Other uncles got varying sentences based on their cooperation. Outside the courthouse, cousins embraced, cried, stood in stunned silence. No cameras captured the moment. No reporters asked questions. Just a family beginning to process the end of a nightmare. Nikki collapsed on the courthouse steps, sobbing with relief. That afternoon, we returned to our various foster homes and temporary arrangements. The Washingtons had prepared a small celebration, just cake and juice, but it felt surreal. Eddie and I sat on the back porch, watching the sunset, trying to comprehend that Saturday fights would never happen again. Over the following weeks, the reality of freedom settled in differently for each cousin. Some threw themselves into school, making up for lost time. Others struggled with the absence of structure, even violent structure. We'd been shaped by the garage, and reshaping ourselves would take time. The Federal Victims Fund coordinator contacted us about the asset distribution. After legal fees and investigation costs, each cousin who'd fought would receive approximately $50,000. Not life-changing money, but enough to start fresh. Some cousins wanted to refuse it, calling it blood money. Others desperately needed it for medical bills and therapy. I watched Joey at a family meeting, his left eye still slightly drooped from his his fight with Frank. He voted to take the money, to use grandfather's cruelty to build something better. The vote passed unanimously. Even those who'd initially resisted understood the practicality. Foster care arrangements began shifting. Some cousins aged out, finding apartments. Others, like Eddie and me, remained with the Washingtons, who'd started paperwork to become permanent guardians. The system moved slowly, but it moved forward. 3 months after the trial, Vincent organized a gathering at the same park where we'd met before. This time, no crisis brought us together, just the need to see each other, to confirm we'd all survived. 28 cousins showed up, including some who'd moved out of state years ago. We played soccer, badly. We ate sandwiches without anyone going hungry. The younger cousins, those saved from ever fighting, ran around like normal children. It was beautiful and strange and sometimes overwhelming. Tommy kept checking over his shoulder, still expecting grandfather to appear. That's when Marcus, Sal's little brother, suggested something that changed everything. He wanted to turn grandfather's garage into something else. The house sat empty, tied up in federal asset forfeiture. But Marcus had been researching community programs. The space that had hosted violence could host healing. The idea seemed impossible at first. Who would fund it? Who would run it? But grandmother surprised us again. She'd been quietly working with lawyers, ensuring the house would go to the victims, not the government. She had plans, connections, a vision for transformation. It took 6 more months of paperwork, permits, and persistence. Eddie and I spent weekends at the property, cleaning out years of blood and pain. We painted over the chalk circle. We installed proper lighting. We turned the garage into a community center for at-risk youth. The grand opening happened on a Saturday, exactly 2 years after the arrests. Cousins came from across the country. We'd invited no media, sent no press releases. This was for us, for our community, for the kids who might otherwise end up in their own versions of grandfather's garage. Vincent ran youth counseling sessions. Tommy taught conflict resolution. Even Nicky, still dealing with his physical scars, volunteered with the after-school program. We used our trauma as tools for prevention. The cycle that had trapped us would end with us. Some uncles, released early for good behavior, tried to reconnect. A few cousins allowed it, cautiously. Others maintained firm boundaries. I saw my father once, at a grocery store. We made eye contact, nodded, kept walking. Some relationships couldn't be rebuilt, and that was okay. Eddie started college, studying social work. I focused on theater, channeling the performance skills I'd learned with blood packets into actual art. Other cousins found their own paths: mechanics, teachers, nurses, regular jobs for regular people, which felt like a miracle after our childhood. The nightmares continued for many of us. The sound of fists on flesh, the smell of blood on concrete, the hunger pangs that felt too familiar. But we had resources now. Therapists who understood trauma, support groups, each other. Healing wasn't linear, but it was possible. 5 years passed. The community center thrived, helping dozens of families. Grandfather remained in federal prison, his empire reduced to a cautionary tale shared in whispers. Some cousins married, had children, created the loving families we'd never known. At Eddie's wedding, I served as best man. Looking out at the reception hall filled with cousins who'd once fought for food, I saw something grandfather never understood. Real strength came from choosing love over violence, healing over hatred, future over past. The scars remained. Joey's damaged eye, Nicky's limp, the invisible wounds we all carried. But scars meant survival. They meant we'd endured and overcome. They were proof that grandfather's legacy of violence had failed to destroy us. On the 10th anniversary of grandfather's arrest, we held a reunion at the community center. 43 cousins attended, plus their children, partners, chosen families. The garage that had once echoed with chants of "blood brings brotherhood" now rang with children's laughter. Grandmother, now in her 80s, sat in the corner watching her great-grandchildren play. She'd never fully explained her years of silence, but her actions since spoke volumes. She'd chosen us over him, finally, and that choice had made all the difference. As the reunion wound down, cousins shared updates, new jobs, graduations, milestones that would have seemed impossible in grandfather's world. We'd built lives of ordinary beauty, free from violence, full of choice. The boy who'd made his cousin bleed was now a man who helped kids find better ways. That night, Eddie and I stood in the transformed garage, remembering. The chalk circle was gone, replaced by colorful mats for children's activities. The walls displayed artwork instead of blood. Everything had changed, and we had changed it. The community center served 200 families now. Former cousins ran programs across 3 states, breaking cycles of violence in their own communities. Grandfather's gambling millions had been transformed into scholarships, therapy funds, and prevention programs. His legacy of cruelty had become our foundation for kindness. I thought about the 10-year-old boy who'd entered this garage terrified, who'd learned to hurt others to avoid hunger. That child felt like a stranger now, separated by years of growth and healing. But I honored him, that scared kid who'd found a way to resist, who'd refused to let violence be his only inheritance. The next morning, I returned to my normal life, teaching drama at a local high school, directing plays where fake blood created art, not survival, living in a small apartment with too many books and a cat named Shakespeare, an ordinary existence that felt extraordinary given where I'd started. Sometimes students asked about my childhood. I gave vague answers about family challenges. The sealed records meant our story stayed private, known only to those who'd lived it. This protection felt right. We'd earned the right to be more than our trauma. Eddie called that evening, as he did most Sundays. His son had started walking. His wife was pregnant again. Life moved forward with beautiful mundanity. We made plans for dinner, for normalcy, for all the small moments grandfather had tried to steal. Before bed, I looked through old photos from the community center's opening day. Cousins standing together, not in a fight circle but in solidarity. Grandmother cutting the ribbon. Children playing where we'd once bled. Evidence that transformation was possible, that violence didn't have to echo through generations. The work continued. Every day brought new challenges, new families seeking help, new cycles to break. But we'd proven it could be done. We'd taken grandfather's garage and made it a place of hope. We'd taken our scars and made them into wisdom. We'd taken our brotherhood of blood and transformed it into a brotherhood of choice.